I want to start with a question that Frederick Douglass posed, and almost nobody answers honestly. What are the colored people doing for themselves? Sit with that for a second. Don't rush past it. I'm not rushing past it. That question has been in the air for over 100 years, in pamphlets, in speeches, in the ongoing argument that Black intellectuals have been having with each other and with America since emancipation. What is remarkable about it is not that it is a difficult question. What is remarkable is how quickly it becomes a loyalty test. Ask it too loudly in one direction, emphasizing self-determination, economic independence, building within, and you get accused of accommodating the system, of asking the oppressed to do the work the oppressor should be doing. Ask it too loudly in the other direction, emphasizing structural change, political confrontation, naming whiteness as a system, and you get accused of victimhood politics, of making excuses, of refusing personal responsibility. Either way, you lose the room. Either way, the question becomes a card check. Not what do you think, but which side are you on? That is a loyalty test, and that is what this episode is about. In episode 1, we looked at the architecture of the quiz, the black card, the proctor visible and invisible, the inherited rules, the way Du Bois's double consciousness moves from the institution into the community and eventually into the nervous system itself. We named the philosophical tradition. We asked what it would mean to stop auditioning. And we closed with this. You were never auditioning. You were always already here. In episode 2, we went deeper into the engine, tribalism, totemism, the way belonging communities become enforcement communities. We asked, what if you don't play spades? What if you don't pledge? We looked at how the inherited proctor migrates from the institution into the people who love you. And we tried to find the livable world, the space Lewis Gordon is pointing at when he asks what freedom means in conditions that aren't yet just. Today, we go upstream. We ask, who built the test? Who built the rubric? Who decided what normal looks like, what the acceptable amount of blackness is, and who gave anyone the authority to grade it? And once we know who built it, what would it mean to organize Black identity not around passing the test, but around being free? I'm MJ, and welcome to Brain Boogerz. If this is your first time here, I'm glad you found us. If you've been here since episode 1, you already know that this space is for serious thinking. Serious, honest, uncomfortable, necessary thinking. And today is the heaviest one we have done so far. I want you to know that going in. This episode moves through a lot of territory. History, economic history, colonial history, the history of religious institutions, political theory across a wide spectrum, including thinkers who disagree profoundly with each other. We're going to hear from conservative scholars, from liberation theologians, from revolutionary figures, from people who sat in very different rooms and came to very different conclusions about what freedom requires and what survival demands. The goal of this episode is not to tell you what to think. The goal is to give you more material to think with. I will say this plainly. This is a podcast. It is education. It is one host working through a tradition of ideas, doing his best to be rigorous and honest about where the evidence leads. It is not a substitute for professional mental health care. It is not a substitute for political organizing. It is not therapy, and I'm not your therapist, nor am I your organizer. I am just a guy with a microphone and too many books. If you are in a hard place right now, and some of what we discussed today can surface some hard things, please reach out. Text HOME to 741-741 to reach the crisis text line, available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Or you can call or text 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Those resources are real, they are free, and the people there are trained. Please use them if you need them. And before we get into it, subscribe if you haven't. Tap the notification bell and share this with someone who needs it or just wants to have a conversation about it. This one goes deep. Let's go. Okay, 5 terms. I want to lay them out before we build the argument, because these words are going to carry a lot of weight and I don't want any of them to slip by. These are not a vocabulary list. Each one is a lens. Each one changes what you see when you look at the same set of facts through it. Whiteness. Not as skin color, not as an ethnic heritage, as a constructed political and economic category. David Roediger in Wages of Whiteness makes the historical argument with precision. Whiteness, as a unified identity, was assembled, not natural. Irish immigrants in the mid-19th century were not always considered white. Italians, Eastern Europeans, Ashkenazi Jews, all of these groups were incorporated into whiteness not because their skin changed, but because they aligned with the racial hierarchy rather than with working class solidarity. Whiteness was and remains a political project, a specific set of choices made by specific people at specific historical moments for specific economic reasons. And if it was constructed, it can be examined, it can be named, it can be dismantled. Understanding whiteness as a political project rather than a biological fact is not a hostile act. It is an analytical one. It is what accuracy requires. Colonization. Not as a synonym for racism. These terms are often used interchangeably, and that conflation costs us analytical precision. Colonization is a specific set of mechanisms with a specific economic architecture. Walter Rodney, in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, defines it with the sharpness it requires. Colonization is the systematic extraction of resources, labor, and wealth from one territory for the benefit of another, combined with the deliberate destruction of the colonized territory's capacity for independent development. That second part is the part we often miss. Colonial power doesn't just take, it disables. It reorganizes the colonized society so that dependency remains, even after the colonizer leaves. The colonizer exits, the underdevelopment stays. Naming this tells us what repair actually requires, not just healing, but rebuilding infrastructure that was deliberately destroyed. And that is a very different scale of work than healing alone. Conscientization. Paulo Freire's term from Education for Critical Consciousness. And I want to do something here that I did in episode 1 when I talked about Foucault and Sartre. I want to name the room these tools were built in before I deploy them. Freire is white and Brazilian. He developed his framework working with peasant communities in northeast Brazil, not with black communities in America or Africa. That matters. Black scholars adopted Freire and extended him because the conscientization framework mapped onto liberation theology, onto black education theory, onto the specific work of building critical consciousness in communities that had been systematically miseducated. Patricia Hill Collins builds on him. James Cone's tradition used him. Freire was taken up because he was useful, not because he was complete, not because he was a master of the black experience. Same rule as always, useful tool, not a master. Conscientization, the concept itself, is the process by which a person or community moves from a naive understanding of their situation to a critical one. Seeing the structures, naming them, developing the organized capacity to act against them. It is not a single moment of awareness, it is an ongoing collective practice. You cannot free yourself from a system you cannot name. That is the insight. It is correct wherever you find it. The Black Radical Tradition. Cedric Robinson gives us the term in Black Marxism. And I need to acknowledge a tension here that I created in episode 1, because if you were paying attention, you caught it. In episode 1, I argued that blackness is a constructed umbrella, that the Yoruba and the Akan did not think of themselves as the same people, that the category black was imposed from outside by the machinery of the slave trade and American racism. And now here I am talking about the Black Radical Tradition like it's a coherent project. That is a tension worth sitting in rather than resolving too quickly. Here's the distinction I want to make. The construction of black as a category was imposed from outside. That part is true. But the building of a tradition within that category, the intellectual labor of Du Bois, Robinson, Fanon, James, Hooks, Shakur, Wells, that was chosen. Deliberate, conscious, generative work done by people who took an imposed category and built something real inside it. The tradition is real because they made it real. That is categorically different from saying it was always natural or inevitable. Tommy Shelby gives us the bridge. What connects the tradition is not shared culture, not shared essence, not some biological solidarity. It is shared political interests and the shared work of building a more just world. The tradition is a project, not a property, and a project that keeps choosing itself across generations is as real as anything gets. Liberation. As distinct from survival, respectability, representation, and the loyalty test. These are four things that often get called liberation, but are not quite the same thing. Survival is necessary. It is the condition of everything else, but it is not liberation. Respectability is a strategy, navigating the expectations of a gatekeeping system, but it is not liberation. Representation is meaningful, seeing people who look like you in positions of visibility and power, but it is not liberation. And the loyalty test, as we have already established, is a mechanism of containment, not a path to freedom. Liberation means the genuine ability of a person and a people to determine the conditions of their own lives, not succeeding within a system designed to exclude you on that system's terms, not being tolerated by the institution, not being visible enough that your presence is accepted. The actual organization of conditions. Douglas named it. Wells pursued it. James theorized it in the context of Haiti. Shakur embodied it. It's the difference between navigating the maze more skillfully and asking who built the maze and why, and what it would mean to dismantle it. Now, before any Western theoretical tools come into this room, I want to establish the foundation this episode is standing on. Because the house we are walking through is black, and the house deserves its own foundation before we bring in anything imported. The Ubuntu tradition, worked out carefully by philosophers like Thaddeus Metz, whose work on African philosophy of personhood and moral standing is among the most rigorous in contemporary philosophy, and by Mogobe Ramose, whose scholarship on Ubuntu as a philosophical system preceded and in many ways prepared the ground for how it is now understood, gives us the most important starting point for this episode. I am because we are. I want you to hear that as an ontological claim, not a bumper sticker, not a motivational sentiment, an argument about the nature of personhood itself. In Ubuntu, personhood is not a property you possess in isolation. It is not something you have first and then figure out how to share. It's something that happens between people, in relationship, in community. You don't become a self and then enter into relationships. You become a self through relationships. Belonging is not a test you have to pass to gain access to personhood. It's the condition of personhood. A world organized around that principle looks fundamentally different from a world organized around the quiz. Metz has demonstrated that this is not a sentimental or pre-philosophical position. It's a rigorously developed framework that handles questions of moral standing, social obligation, and political responsibility with precision. Ubuntu does not leave individual agency out. It situates individual agency within a relational context that makes it coherent. Freedom, in the Ubuntu tradition, is not the freedom of the isolated individual to do whatever they want. It is the freedom of a person and community to flourish in a way that makes the flourishing of others possible. That is the frame. That is the house. Now the tools. Du Bois gives us three texts that work like a triptych. The Souls of Black Folk is the interior map. Double consciousness, the invisible proctor, the gaze we carry inside ourselves. We used it extensively in episode 1. Dark Water, published in 1920, makes the interior analysis global. What does white supremacy look like as a world system? How does colonialism in Africa, in Asia, in the Caribbean connect to racial dynamics in Atlanta and Birmingham? His answer is that they are the same project at different scales. Same logic, same economic architecture, operating at different distances from the center. And then the gift of black folk. Du Bois argues in it that black people are not just victims of American history. They are its most generative force. The labor, the music, the resistance, the democratic impulse. The argument is that America would be both morally and economically lesser without everything black Americans built, suffered, and refused. All three books together give you a mind that refuses to stay in one room. Fanon adds something more challenging, particularly from black skin, white masks. He distinguishes racial consciousness, organizing identity around a race as a fixed essential category, from national consciousness, organizing identity around a shared political project of liberation. His argument is that racial consciousness, however understandable as a stage of development, ultimately cannot produce genuine freedom. It accepts the colonizer's terms. It takes the category the colonizer assigned and fights inside it. The loyalty test says, stay inside the category, prove you belong. Fanon says, the category itself is part of what we're fighting. That is a harder argument. It is also a more accurate one. Fred Moten, in Black and Blur, gives us something that functions almost as an aesthetic argument, but lands as a political one. The blur is not a failure of definition. It is a practice of freedom. The loyalty test wants categorical clarity. It wants to know where you stand so it can grade you against the rubric. The blur refuses to be fully legible. What cannot be captured cannot be contained. That refusal extends from hair into the political dimension we are going to be working through today. C.L.R. James in The Black Jacobins gives us Haiti in 1804 as proof of concept. The formerly enslaved people of Saint-Domingue analyzed their conditions, built collective organization, and refused the terms of the world imposed on them. Liberation is not metaphor, it's not theory, it's a historical event. It happened once, and the conditions for it to happen again exist. Freire's conscientization framework belongs here as well. The ongoing, collective, necessarily imperfect practice of seeing the situation clearly enough to act in it, not once, not at a specific moment of awakening, continually, together. So this got me wondering what whiteness actually is and isn't. Here's the essential argument of this section, and I want to say it plainly before I build the case for it. Whiteness is not biology, it's not even primarily culture. It's a political and economic arrangement. Understanding that changes what you think the problem is, and it changes what you think the solution might be. Rodegur's The Wages of Whiteness is the historical groundwork. Rodegur documents how antebellum white workers, particularly Irish immigrants, who were in many cases economically indistinguishable from enslaved black workers in their living and working conditions, came to identify with whiteness rather than with working class solidarity. The mechanism he identifies is what he calls the psychological wage. You may be poor, but you're not black. The wage cost the employer nothing and broke solidarity among the working people at every critical moment in American labor history. It has been enough ever since. The Irish dock worker, who would have been a natural political ally to the black dock worker, chose instead to align with the system that kept them both poor because the system offered him something the alliance couldn't: the reassurance that he was not at the bottom. That is not a critique of the Irish dock worker as an individual. That is a structural analysis of a system designed to produce exactly that choice. Now, Thomas Sowell. And I want to do something I'm going to do every single time I engage Sowell in this series. I'm going to name where he sits before I engage his argument, because the context shapes how you receive the content. Sowell is a black conservative economist associated with the Hoover Institution at Stanford. His policy positions have been used extensively by people who want to dismantle race-conscious policy. affirmative action, reparations, targeted economic programs. And that is not a coincidence. His work is more careful and more nuanced than the people who weaponize it, but that doesn't mean the weapons don't exist, and it doesn't mean he is unaware of who's using his name and for what. I'm engaging him because his challenge is real and deserves a real answer, not to give cover to what gets done with his analysis downstream. In Black Rednecks and White Liberals, C.L.R argues that many features of what is now identified as distinctively Black American culture, certain speech patterns, educational attitudes, approaches to violence, and honor culture, did not originate in African traditions. They originated in the culture of poor white Scots-Irish immigrants, particularly from specific regions of the British Isles, and were transmitted across racial lines through geographic proximity during and after slavery. His argument that cultural transmission across color lines is real and historically documented, that is correct. Cultures do not stay contained within racial categories. They move, they mix, they get adopted and adapted. That much is true. Where the framework stops too early is this: where do those particular patterns come from, and what conditions sustain them across generations? The poverty, the exclusion, the systematic denial of ability to accumulate wealth, the violence. These are structural conditions that generate cultural adaptations. Communities under sustained pressure develop practices that help them survive the pressure. You cannot separate what a community has culturally absorbed from the conditions under which it was forced to live. The culture is, in part, a response to the structure. To name the culture without naming the structure that produced it is to do half the analysis, and half an analysis leads to half, or worse than half, a solution. I want to be clear about what I'm saying and not saying here. Giving C.L.R a fair hearing is not the same as endorsing his broader policy conclusions. The challenge he raises about cultural agency is worth engaging seriously. The conclusion his framework is most often used to support, that structural remedies are unnecessary, that the gap can be closed entirely through cultural change without addressing the material conditions that produced it, that is a different argument, and not one this episode is making. Orlando Patterson belongs in this conversation alongside C.L.R, and his presence here matters. Patterson's Slavery and Social Death is one of the most rigorous sociological analyses of what slavery does to a people, across cultures, across centuries. He asks similar questions about agency and resilience without carrying the political freight C.L.R carries. Patterson's framework takes both structure and agency seriously. He does not minimize one to elevate the other. The social death that slavery imposed, the systematic erasure of lineage, of identity, of social standing, is real and documented across every slave society in history. And his interest in how communities recover self-determination after that specific trauma is where his framework becomes generative. Structure created the conditions. Agency navigates within and against those conditions. Removing either from the analysis produces a distorted map. Patterson holds both. That is the synthesis worth working toward. Carol Anderson's White Rage gives us something that C.L.R.'s comparative analysis does not account for: the active maintenance of the gap. C.L.R. documents disparities across groups. Anderson documents who kept digging the gap wider, deliberately, systematically, in direct response to Black progress rather than in spite of it. The Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921, Black Wall Street, one of the most economically prosperous Black communities in the country, destroyed in 2 days. The systematic exclusion of Black veterans from the GI Bill, one of the most significant wealth-building programs in American history, administered in ways that specifically blocked Black men from accessing what their white counterparts received. Redlining. The federal policy that explicitly excluded Black neighborhoods from the wealth-building mechanism of home ownership for decades. C.L.R. sees the gap. Anderson explains who kept making it wider, deliberately, every time Black Americans developed the economic capacity and political power that threatened to close it. C. Van Woodward's The Strange Career of Jim Crow adds something powerful and I want to make sure that lands. Jim Crow was not an ancient Southern tradition rooted deep in the immovable culture of the South. It was a relatively recent invention, consolidated in the 1890s in direct response to the real possibility of Black political power during Reconstruction. It was a political backlash codified as law. And what is made by choice, what is built deliberately to serve a specific political function at a specific historical moment, can be unmade by choice. That is not optimism, that is the historical record. Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility documents the contemporary interpersonal expression of the structural analysis, the discomfort, the defensiveness, the shutdown that many white people experience when racial dynamics are named directly in conversation. DiAngelo's argument is that this fragility functions as a mechanism of resistance, that it consistently redirects conversations about race back to the comfort and feelings of white people in the room, away from the substance of what is being discussed. Derald Wing Su, in Race Talk and the Conspiracy of Silence, maps the specific moves, colorblindness claims, subject changes, expressions of hurt or offense. These are the operational tactics through which structural analysis gets deflected in real time, in real rooms by real people who have not examined what they are doing. And then soul again, in Intellectuals and Race, provides a counterweight worth taking seriously. Structural explanations, when they become total, when they explain everything and leave no room for individual choice and agency, can create their own form of intellectual dependency. A framework in which Black people are always acted upon, never acting, always victims of forces, never makers of decisions, is not accurate and is not liberating. The danger is real, but the solution is not to choose between structure and agency as though they are mutually exclusive. They're not. Structure creates conditions. Agency navigates within and against those conditions. Removing either produces a distorted map. The tension between them is where the honest thinking happens. That is where we have to live. This is why the loyalty test, am I Black enough? Am I white enough? Is not just socially uncomfortable. It is epistemologically broken. It asks you to measure yourself against a standard that has never been consistent, that has always been politically motivated, and that has changed every time a political project required a different measurement. You cannot pass a test with no stable rubric, and the test was never designed to be passed. It was designed to keep you measuring. Am I white enough? Ask that question in Virginia in 1924 under the Racial Integrity Act. The answer is almost certainly no, because one drop makes you Black, full stop. Ask it in Rio de Janeiro in 1920. The answer might be yes, or maybe, depending on your complexion and your grandmother's, depending on your economic position, depending on the social calculation of the person assigning the category. Ask it in Mexico City in 1750. There are 16 official casta categories that might apply to you, depending on the combination of your ancestry. Ask it in Port-au-Prince in 1805. The question has been declared illegal. Everyone is Black by constitutional decree. Fred Moten's blur is not just an aesthetic argument, it's a political fact. The blur is what race actually is when you strip away the infrastructure built to contain it. And the absurdity, the 16 casta categories, the pencil in the hair, the one-drop rule. The absurdity is not a flaw in the system. The absurdity is the system. What happens when you try to perform a biological measurement on a political assignment? Now, before we go global, before we look at colonization's mechanics across continents and centuries, I need to make a stop. Because we just established that whiteness is a political construction. I want to show you exactly how deliberately assembled it is. I want to show you the seams. The one-drop rule, America. Sit with this. In America, the answer to who is Black has a very specific legal history. It is called hypodescent. technically, formally. Colloquially, it is called the one-drop rule. The principle, codified in various state laws across the 20th century, most notoriously in Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924, is this: any person with any known African ancestry is classified as black. One drop, one ancestor. 63 64ths European and 1 64th African, you're black. For the purposes of enslavement, for the purposes of segregation, for the purposes of legal exclusion from property ownership, from voting, from education, from marriage to a white person. The rule was designed with a specific political purpose: to maximize the number of people who could be enslaved and later segregated. The larger the black population, the larger the labor supply. The larger the excluded class, the more concentrated the wealth is at the top. One drop was not biology. It was about property, about who could be owned. Embranquecimento. Now, let me take you to Brazil, a country with more people of African descent than any country outside the African continent itself, and where the logic ran in the exact opposite direction. The Brazilian government in the late 19th and early 20th centuries pursued an official policy called embranquecimento, whitening. The explicit national project was to gradually whiten the Brazilian population through European immigration and intermarriage. Lighter skin represented upward social mobility. The more European your ancestry, the more access you had to status, to economic opportunity, to the social category of branco. Where American law said one drop of black blood makes you black, period, end of sentence, Brazilian social logic said one drop of white blood can elevate you, can move you out of one category and into a better one. The census at various points recorded over 130 color categories, not black or white, over 130 gradations, because the system needed that many rungs to keep everyone oriented toward the top, reaching for the category above them, never organizing horizontally with the people beside them. The Sistema de Castas. In colonial Spanish America, they built an entire taxonomy. They called it the Sistema de Castas, the caste system. And it was elaborate enough to require its own art form. Español plus Indio equals mestizo. Español plus negro equals mulatto. Mestizo plus Español equals castizo. Castizo plus Español equals, eventually after enough generations of the right intermarriage, after enough biological whitening, reclassification as Spanish, as white, as free from the lowest category. They painted these categories, literally. There are surviving Casta paintings from 18th century Mexico, artworks commissioned to document the racial arithmetic of the colonial project. Parents on the left, parents on the right, and the child in the middle labeled with their official category. A system that said whiteness is something you can earn through the right ancestry over enough generations with enough strategic choices about who you marry and who your children marry. The carrot, not just the stick. The pencil test, South Africa. In South Africa under apartheid, the Population Registration Act of 1950 created 4 official racial categories: white, colored, Indian, and native. If your classification was ambiguous, if you sat at a border between categories that the state needed to enforce, the state had methods. One was called the pencil test. An official would insert a pencil into your hair. If it fell out, you might be classified as white or colored. If it stayed, if your hair held the pencil, you were likely classified as black. Your hair texture determined where you could live, where you could work, who you could legally marry, whether your children could attend school, what medical care you could receive, and where you could be buried. The body graded before it opens its mouth, which we talked about in episode 2. was literally, here, a pencil in your hair. Haiti, 1805, the refusal. The year after independence, Haiti's constitution declared, explicitly, deliberately, as a matter of state policy, that all Haitian citizens, regardless of skin color, are black. White Europeans were prohibited from owning property in the new republic. The nation that had just defeated Napoleon, that had just turned the most effective military force in the world back at the shores of the Caribbean, looked at every racial classification system built by the colonial world and said, "We're refusing your categories. Every person here is black." That is not a biological measurement. That is a political act of refusal, an act of radical resignification. We will take the word you use to degrade us and make it our declaration of sovereignty. Which system found the biological truth? Which measurement was accurate? 1 drop makes you black, 1 drop elevates you, 130 categories of gradation, a pencil in your hair? Everyone is black by political declaration? None of them. All of them are wrong. None in the sense of being mathematically imprecise, wrong in the sense of being a question that has no biological answer and then pretending it does. Race is not in the blood. It is not in the hair. It is not in the fraction of your ancestry. It is in the political project that needs a measurement system in order to sort people into slots the project requires. And the measurement changes when the project changes. The absurdity is the system, and you cannot pass a test built on absurdity. You can only name the absurdity clearly enough that the test loses its power over you. So let's talk about the mechanics of how colonization actually works. I want to spend real time here, because the American story is only fully legible when you understand it as one instance of a global pattern. The test, the rubric, the proctor from episodes 1 and 2, they didn't originate in a particular city in the American South or in a particular decade of American history. They connected the root to a set of mechanisms that operated globally for centuries across multiple continents. And this is where episodes 1, 2, and 3 of this series finally converge at the foundation. Michael Gomez in African Dominion gives us the world that existed before. The peoples who were enslaved came from complex, organized, politically sophisticated societies. The Mali Empire, the Songhai Empire, the Yoruba Kingdoms, the Zulu Nation, the Ashanti Confederacy. I named some of them in episode 1, the roll call of peoples who did not think of themselves as black because they had their own names and their own governance and their own ways of understanding who they were and who they owed loyalty to. These were not pre-political peoples who needed organizing. They were organized people who were violently disorganized. Chancellor Williams, in Destruction of Black Civilization, documents the systematic nature of that disorganization. The undermining of African civilization was not incidental to colonial expansion. It was its method. The colonizers did not simply extract resources and leave the social infrastructure intact. They destroyed political structures that would have enabled organized resistance. They rewrote historical memory so that African people could not draw on the record of their own capacity and achievement. They imposed foreign religious frameworks that redefined the relationship between the African person and the sacred, between the African person and the community, and between the African person and the land. They deliberately fragmented ethnic and linguistic communities that might otherwise have organized effective opposition. A people who know their history, who maintain their political and cultural institutions, who have access to their own names and their own stories, they are much harder to colonize. The colonizer understood this. The destruction was intentional. Carter G. Woodson's classroom-level analysis from episode 2, The Miseducation of the Negro, is the domestic version of the civilizational scale project Williams documents. Same logic, different room. Walter Rodney in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa makes the economic case with a precision that should be required reading in every economics curriculum in the world. Africa was not poor before European colonization in the sense of being behind on some inevitable linear progress curve. It was actively underdeveloped. And he uses that word as a verb, not an adjective. The surplus was systematically extracted. the institutions that would have enabled independent economic development were dismantled by design. The trade relations were restructured to benefit European economies at African expense. And those restructured relations were locked in by treaty, by debt, and eventually by military force when treaty and debt were insufficient. The poverty of contemporary Africa and the wealth of contemporary Europe are not parallel facts about two different worlds. They are causally connected facts about the same world. You cannot understand one without the other. The American Slave Coast, the scholarship gathered in Slavery's Capitalism, and Stephanie Jones Rogers, They Were Her Property, together established something that American economic history has been so slow to name clearly. The internal slave trade was one of the largest capital markets in 19th century America. The value of enslaved human beings exceeded the value of all of the railroads and all of the factories in the country combined at the peak of the antebellum economy. American industrial capitalism did not develop alongside slavery as a separate economic system. It built on the accumulated capital of slavery. And Jones Rogers' contributions is to make visible what the traditional story left out. White women were not passive observers of this system. They were slaveholders, enforcers, investors. The economic architecture of American capitalism is genealogy, and that genealogy begins in the plantation. Juan Gonzalez in Harvest of Empire applies the same colonial economic logic to the largest migration wave in the Western Hemisphere. The people called immigrants or refugees or invaders, depending on who is doing the calling and what political purpose the name serves, are largely people whose countries were destabilized by the same pattern. Guatemala, El Salvador, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, different nations, different decades, same script. Colonial extraction restructures the economy so that dependency on the colonizer remains even after the formal colonial relationship ends. The poverty that drives migration was produced by the same forces that produced the wealth of the destination country. That is not coincidence, that is the mechanism. The wealth that funds contemporary institutions, universities, banks, insurance companies, media organizations, venture capital funds, endowments, carries the fingerprints of this history. Once you see the genealogy, the question of how to repair the damage stops being abstract. It becomes a question of accounting, and the loyalty test wants to prevent that accounting by keeping the analysis local, personal, and about whether you are black enough, keeping you too busy arguing about the quiz to ask who designed it and what it was designed to protect. Alright, so I want to touch a little bit on the church and colonization and liberation from the same building. And before I bring Freire in here, I want to do something that I think the episode requires. I want to go back to episode 1 for a moment. Because in episode 1, I said that the inherited rules, the quiz, the proctor, the standards we carry inside ourselves, they came from somewhere. They came from fear, from survival, from love that got twisted by a world that kept measuring people and punishing them for not measuring up to an impossible standard. I said, have compassion for the people who have passed those rules on, because they were navigating conditions of real danger with the tools they had available. That was true of the black card. It is equally true of the theology of accommodation that emerged in the context of slavery. The people who absorbed those survival instructions were not spiritually broken or intellectually incapable. They were navigating conditions of lethal violence with the tools the moment provided. Freire does not undo that compassion, he deepens it. His argument is not that the people who carry these rules are weak or foolish, it is that this is exactly what centuries of structured dehumanization produces in a people. The compassion and the structural critique are not in tension. They are the same observation from two different attitudes. Albert Roboteau in Slave Religion gives us the full complexity of what happened to Christianity in the context of American slavery. Enslaved people were given the master's religion as an instrument of control. Slave theology, formally, explicitly, in the sermons slaveholders paid preachers to deliver, insisted on obedience to earthly masters, on patience and suffering, and on reward deferred to the afterlife. It was a theology designed to make exploitation not just tolerable, but spiritually virtuous. A colonization of the spirit. But enslaved people did something with that religion that the slaveholders did not anticipate. They read it differently. They found in the Hebrew Bible a God who sides with enslaved people against Pharaoh, explicitly, repeatedly, as the central narrative of the text. They built what Roberto calls the invisible institution, worship practices conducted out of the sight of the master, carrying the real theological content of their faith in spaces they controlled. They took the colonizer's religion and read it against the colonizer. That is not accommodation, that is the most sophisticated kind of resistance. It requires more intelligence, more precision, and more sustained courage than outright refusal. James Cone, in A Black Theology of Liberation, Black Theology and Black Power, and God of the Oppressed, builds from that reading and makes the theological argument with full rigor. The God of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures is, by consistent textual evidence, a God who stands on the side of the oppressed against their oppressors. This is not a political interpretation imposed on a neutral text. It is the most straightforward reading of the narrative available. The Exodus is the central event of the Hebrew Bible. The Magnificat is the opening declaration of the Gospel of Luke. The prophetic tradition from Amos to Isaiah to Micah is sustained and consistent in its indictment of economic exploitation and its insistence that God is especially concerned with the poor and the marginalized. A theology that asks Black people to accept their oppression as God's will has not just made a political error, it has made a hermeneutical one. It has misread the book. Raphael Warnock's The Divided Mind of the Black Church gives us what is perhaps the most honest account available of the institution that has been simultaneously the most liberatory and the most contested space in Black American life. The Black Church has produced Nat Turner and Booker T. Washington, Martin Luther King Jr. and Prosperity Gospel, liberation theology and respectability politics. Warnock does not resolve the division by choosing a side. He argues that the division is not a failure of the institution. It is the record of a community arguing with itself, across generations, in real time with real stakes, about what freedom requires and what survival demands. That argument is still happening, every Sunday, in many rooms simultaneously. Esau Macaulay, in Reading While Black, makes the contribution that closes this section with precision. Black readers bring a hermeneutic to Scripture, a set of interpretive instincts and questions that has been systematically dismissed or ignored by the mainstream of white Western Christianity. This is not a distortion of the tradition. It is a recovery of what the text was already saying before Christian empire, in its various forms, had its way with it. Black interpretation is not deviation from the tradition. In many ways, it is a return to the origins of the tradition, to a set of texts written by people who were themselves at the margins of empire, navigating occupation, navigating exploitation, asking what the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob had to say to people in conditions exactly like theirs. The loyalty test, when it operates in religious spaces, demanding a specific theology, a specific practice, a specific level of church attendance as proof of authentic Blackness, a specific relationship to institutional Christianity as evidence of cultural belonging, is taking that liberatory space and turning it back into an audition. Same building, same hymns, different function, and the tradition itself, at its most rigorous, has the tools to recognize the difference and name it. Alright, so let's talk about the freedom tradition via multiple models, but going in one direction. And this is the section I've been building toward. And I want to say that plainly, with some energy, because this is where the episode gets to stop laying bricks and starts walking through the house. The loyalty test flattens the freedom tradition. It picks a contemporary political lane and then grades every historical figure in the tradition against it, as though Douglass was navigating conditions similar to ours, as though Du Bois should have had the same politics in 1903 and in 1945, as though King and Malcolm X were opposite poles rather than two minds converging toward the same analysis from different angles. The loyalty test grades people who were not navigating anything close to what today's critics are navigating, in conditions none of them chose. Let me show you what the tradition actually looks like at full complexity. Frederick Douglass. Two texts, not one. The narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, published in 1845, the story of a man escaping slavery, finding language, finding himself, publishing his own story at real personal risk because the story needed to exist in the world? Consequential. Widely read. Rightly so. But then, My Bondage and My Freedom, published in 1855, a different book. Deeper. More politically sophisticated. Douglass at 37 has argued with William Lloyd Garrison about the Constitution, has broken with white abolitionism over the question of black political autonomy, has watched Reconstruction begin to take shape in the distance and understood what it would require, a mind in motion, publicly updating its analysis as conditions change, without apologizing for the update, without pretending the earlier position was wrong when it was the right position for the earlier conditions. Intellectual flexibility is itself a lesson. Conscientization in real time, across a decade, published for the world to see. Booker T. Washington. Fairness before critique. Up from slavery and the Tuskegee program, the insistence on economic self-sufficiency, on skilled labor, on building institutional capacity from within, was not accommodation. It was not naivete. It was not a failure to understand the system. Washington was navigating Reconstruction's collapse, the active reign of lynching terror, the deliberate withdrawal of federal protection for black political rights, a political environment in which open confrontation was being answered with organized, unpunished murder. His calculation? If the political system is actively trying to kill you, and there is currently no effective counterforce to stop it, build an economic foundation that will eventually make political change possible. Build the institutions. Survive long enough to organize. The critique, Du Bois's critique in The Souls of Black Folk, is not that the strategy was wrong in its own terms. It's that it accepted too many of the terms of the debate, that it accommodated too much in the name of surviving to organize tomorrow. The loyalty test picks one of these men and dismisses the other. The liberation framework says, hold both. Ask which strategy is appropriate for these specific conditions. That is a harder question. It's also the right question. Ida B. Wells. Callie Nicole Gross's biography and Wells's own memoir, Crusade for Justice, together with The Light of Truth, Writings of an Anti-Lynching Crusader, gives us something that neither Douglass nor Washington nor Du Bois quite gives: the investigative journalist as liberation theorist. Wells went into the counties where lynchings had occurred. She gathered the facts, talked to witnesses, examined the economic relationships between the victims and the men who murdered them. She named the economic structure of lynching with a precision that was more dangerous than any speech. It was used systematically to eliminate black economic competitors, to destroy black businesses and black wealth that had begun to challenge white economic dominance in specific local markets. Not primarily about sexual fear, as the popular justification claimed, about economics, about property, about who was allowed to succeed in a market economy and who needed to be destroyed for having the audacity to succeed. When her newspaper offices were burned and she received death threats, she went to Britain and built international pressure against American lynching when domestic pressure was blocked. The method? Name it precisely. Document it exhaustively. Build coalition when the nearest door is blocked, and don't stop because someone threatens you. That is not a 19th century method. That is the method. C.L.R. James in Haiti. The Black Jacobins gives us the proof of concept. 1804. The formerly enslaved people of Saint-Domingue defeated Napoleon's army. They didn't wait for the right conditions, the right ideology, the right moment to be recognized as fully human by the people who had enslaved them. They analyzed the conditions, built the organization, and moved. Liberation is not metaphor. It is not a theoretical construct. It is a historical event that happened once and whose implications the world has been trying to contain ever since. But I need to tell you what happened after 1804, because the Haiti story does not end with independence, and understanding what came next is the most important part of the story for this episode's argument. In 1825, 21 years after Haitian independence, France sent warships to the harbor of Port-au-Prince and issued an ultimatum. Haiti would pay 150 million gold francs, later reduced under pressure to 90 million, which was still an astronomical sum that dwarfed Haiti's entire national budget, as reparations to France. Reparations to France for the loss of their enslaved property, for the economic cost incurred by slaveholders who lost their investment when the enslaved people freed themselves. France, backed by the implied military threat of the warships in the harbor, extracted a promise from the nation it had once enslaved to pay for the privilege of no longer being enslaved. Haiti, to maintain its independence and avoid re-enslavement, because re-enslavement was a real possibility, not a rhetorical one, agreed to pay. It took Haiti 122 years to finish paying that debt. The final payment was made in 1947. To service the debt, Haiti had to borrow from French banks and later from American banks at interest, which meant paying for the cost of freedom with compounding interest on top of the original sum. A 2022 journalistic investigation estimated that the total economic impact of that debt on Haiti's development over 2 centuries, the compounding opportunity cost, the infrastructure that was never built, the institutions that were never funded because the money was going to Paris, ran into the tens of billions of dollars. Think about that for a moment. The people who freed themselves were forced to pay for the cost of their own freedom. For over a century, with interest. That is not ancient history. That is a debt that was not finished being paid until 2 years after Jackie Robinson integrated Major League Baseball. That is the mechanism of how liberation gets punished, and why the freedom tradition has always understood that winning the revolution is not the same as securing the conditions of freedom. The loyalty test at its biggest scale is this: can you be free if the world makes you pay for it? Martin Luther King Jr. Letter from Birmingham Jail makes the argument the Black freedom tradition has to remake in every generation. The urgency of now. Written to white moderate clergy who thought King was moving too fast, who counseled patience and negotiation and good faith with people who had demonstrated no good faith, freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. That is not idealism. That is analysis. Stride Toward Freedom documents the Montgomery bus boycott as strategy and practice, nonviolent direct action forcing the contradiction between American democratic ideals and the American racial reality to become visible and politically unsustainable. In his final years, King was moving toward the analysis Malcolm X had been making for over a decade, that structural racism and economic exploitation were the same problem, and that addressing them would require confronting systems, not just hearts. Both were pointing in the same direction. The loyalty test stops them both at the road sign. The liberation framework follows the road. Michelle Alexander. The New Jim Crow is the documentation that Jim Crow took off one costume and put on another. Mass incarceration as the latest iteration of racial control, the maintenance of a racial caste system through the criminal justice system, achieving all the old effects of exclusion, disenfranchisement, and community destabilization without explicit racial language. The system adapted. The mechanism got new branding. And connecting directly to episode 1's Foucault, the test gets a new proctor, the cage gets new keys, the architecture stays. Assata Shakur. Assata Shakur's memoir gives us the most embodied version of what liberation looks like when the state has decided your body is the battlefield. She belongs in the freedom tradition, in the dimension that the non-violent tradition sometimes leaves under-theorized. What the state is willing to do to a Black woman it has decided is an enemy. And her response? To keep surviving, keep thinking, keep speaking, to refuse the verdict the state wrote for her. Is liberation not as a political category, but as a daily practice? Refusal, sustained over a lifetime, is a form of argument. It says, I am not what you decided I was. And Cedric Robinson. Black Marxism gives us the theoretical architecture for understanding everything we have traced. The Black liberation tradition constitutes a unified, internally contested tradition of radical thought. It's not derivative of European radical traditions, its central analytical contribution, that racial capitalism is the structure being fought, not racism and capitalism as separate problems that happened to coexist, is more precise than either term alone. They were built together, they must be analyzed together, and they must be dismantled together, because dismantling one without the other leaves the mechanism intact under a different name. Beverly Daniel Tatum in Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? A book whose title functions as both the question and, after you read it, the answer, makes a developmental argument that I want to hold carefully, because it is easy to misread it. Tatum is not making a sociological observation about comfort preferences or social clustering. She is making a developmental argument. Black teenagers in a predominantly white institutional environment are navigating the specific developmental task of racial identity formation under conditions of ambient hostility. When the surrounding environment sends consistent messages that your presence is provisional, that you are here on tolerance rather than on right, that you are interesting or exceptional or threatening but not simply welcome, community with people who share that identity is not retreat, it is repair. It's a developmental necessity, not a failure to integrate. I said in episode 1 that belonging spaces can become surveillance spaces when inherited rules start running inside them. Tatum shows us the developmental reason those spaces form in the first place. They are psychologically necessary. The community provides shelter from a world that is consistently measuring and consistently finding you either insufficient or excessive, depending on what the context requires. That necessity is real, and it is also where the loyalty test finds its opening, because the same community that provides necessary shelter from a hostile world can begin to police the borders of its own safety in ways that reproduce the very hostility it was built to resist. I want to hold the comparison here. The comparison I named in episode 1 and later reinforced. Those rules, who to be, how to speak, what music to listen to, what politics to hold, how to wear your hair, which institutions to affiliate with as proof of genuine Blackness, most of them were installed with love. They were the community trying to protect its own members from a world that kept measuring and punishing deviation. That is where they came from. They were not installed by villains, they were installed by people trying to keep each other safe. Freire names the mechanism, the internalization of the oppressor, but he does not name the people carrying those rules as weak or complicit. He names them as human beings doing what human beings do under sustained external pressure, absorbing the terms of the oppressor because the alternative, in a given historical moment, seemed more dangerous. The most efficient prison is the one you maintain yourself. That is not a character indictment, that is a structural analysis. And the most powerful act of freedom is noticing you are holding the lock. Durald Wing Su in Race Talk and the Conspiracy of Silence documents how conversations about race get shut down. Primarily in his analysis, through white avoidance of the discomfort that honest racial conversation provides. But the mechanism operates in every community. The use of discomfort as a reason to end analysis, the conversion of intellectual disagreement into a character verdict. The loyalty test silences analysis by making it a test of identity. You're not wrong about this argument, you're a sellout. You're not making a case that deserves engagement, you're demonstrating that you have sided with the wrong people. The question, "Are you one of us?" replaces the question, "Is this analysis accurate?" That substitution is catastrophic for the tradition because the tradition has always depended on the willingness to argue accurately, even when accuracy is uncomfortable, even when it produces disagreement, even when it requires updating a position you held publicly. Soul, in Intellectuals and Race, raises a critique that belongs on the table even in an episode that is otherwise running in a different direction. It is possible to use liberation rhetoric as a credential, to perform radical analysis while building comfortable institutional positions, to name the structural conditions with eloquence while doing nothing to change them, to use the framework as a substitute for the work rather than as a guide toward it. That critique is real, and it deserves to be taken seriously. What it can't do, what it must not be permitted to do, is substitute for the structural analysis itself. Naming the misuse of a framework is not the same as discrediting the framework. The fact that someone can carry a hammer and never drive a nail does not mean hammers do not build homes. Woodson, in The Miseducation of the Negro, gives us the sharpest summary. The product of an education system designed to make Black people serve the system that oppresses them is a mind that does the system's work without being asked. That enforces the system's standards without being paid. That maintains the system's definitions without noticing it is doing so. And now, the through line across all 3 episodes is visible at once. In episode 1, The Invisible Proctor, the gaze that moved from the institution into community into nervous system. In episode 2, how tribalism, totemism, and essentialism perpetuate the proctor's practices. Now, in episode 3, we're naming where the invisible proctor came from. It did not originate in the community, it was imported, it was installed. It was installed by a set of historical processes that we have now named with precision. You are holding the lock, and you can put it down. So what does liberation actually look like organized around freedom? And I want to be honest with you about this section. I don't have a clean answer. Nobody does. Not in the abstract, not as a universal template that applies across every context and every condition. The freedom tradition has been arguing about this for 200 years, precisely because it cannot be resolved in the abstract. The argument is itself the evidence that the tradition is alive, but some directions can be named. Some orientations are more useful than others. Here are 5. First, material conditions and political interests, not cultural performance. Tommy Shelby gives us the most useful framework here. The shared interests of Black Americans, the interest in ending racially structured poverty, in dismantling mass incarceration as a system of racial control, in ending the systematic underfunding of Black schools, in ending the medical neglect documented in episode 2 at the level of stress biology and cellular aging. These are the interests that can be named clearly, organized around concretely, and measured as political outcomes. They do not require cultural uniformity. Whether you are dark-skinned or light-skinned, whether you code switch or refuse to, whether your hair is natural or pressed, whether you attend an HBCU or a predominantly white institution, whether you listen to gospel or trap or jazz or classical, these are not the test. The question is, are you committed to changing the material conditions? That is a question with a political answer, not an identity answer, and it opens the coalition rather than narrowing it. Second, the whole tradition, not just the approved parts. Douglass and Washington were not enemies in any way that should matter to us now. They were strategists in different conditions, making different calculations about what the moment required. Du Bois and Washington were not arguing about opposite things, they were arguing about emphasis, about timing, about which threat was most urgent. King and Malcolm X were not opposite poles. They were converging in their final years toward the same structural analysis, from different starting points and different tactical traditions. The loyalty test stops them both at the road sign and makes each one a credential for a predetermined position. The liberation framework follows the road they were both walking in the same direction. Third, international dimensions. Du Bois knew this in Darkwater. James knew it in The Black Jacobins. Rodney knew it in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. The liberation of Black people in America is not a purely American question. The global dimensions are not background context. They are the frame. Once the analysis goes global, the scale of the repair work becomes visible, and the visibility of what is owed is itself a threat to the order that owes it, which is why the analysis is consistently resisted at the level of political discourse. Fourth, no unified culture identity required. Moten's blur is the right framework. The insistence that there is one correct way to be Black, one acceptable politics, one authentic culture, one legitimate aesthetic, one proper relationship to Christianity, one acceptable way of speaking, is an essentialism that the colonizing system is perfectly happy to encourage because it keeps Black people arguing about cultural authenticity rather than organizing around political interests. The Haitian revolutionaries were not culturally uniform. They were divided by language, by ethnic origin, by specific conditions and decades of enslavement. They were politically unified around a single goal: ending slavery and founding a free state. The goal provided the solidarity. Cultural differences were navigated imperfectly, with conflict, with compromise, with the ongoing work of building something from people who did not already agree because the goal was more important than the uniformity. And fifth, sustained reading and intellectual engagement. Macaulay's Reading While Black, bringing your full, specific, historically situated self to a text and letting the encounter transform both you and your understanding of the text. That is what Du Bois did with European philosophy, what James did with Marxism, what Cone did with Christian theology, what Wells did with investigative journalism, what Freire, in his own limited way, did with educational theory. What this series is attempting to do with all of the above. Bring your full self. Let the tradition speak back. Update the analysis when the evidence requires it, and keep moving. Alright, so before we end, I want to be precise about what this episode is not saying, because these arguments are dense, and the places where they can be misread are real. On Black solidarity, I'm not saying that Black solidarity is unnecessary or harmful. The problem is not solidarity. The problem is when solidarity becomes a loyalty test, when collective action becomes a demand for identical thought, and when thinking differently becomes evidence of defection. Solidarity organized around shared political interests and mutual commitment to changing material conditions is the most powerful thing this tradition has ever produced. That is not what I'm questioning. What I'm questioning is solidarity as cultural policing. Those are not the same thing. On Thomas Sowell, I'm not saying Sowell has no useful analysis. His insistence on human agency, on the real consequences of cultural practices, on the dangers of frameworks that remove individual accountability from the picture, these are not nothing. They belong in a complete analysis. What I'm saying is that Sowell's framework stops one step too early when it fails to account for the structural conditions that produced the cultural patterns he observes. And what I'm saying about the use of his work is that the argument his framework is most often deployed to support, that structural remedies are unnecessary, is a different argument than the one he is actually making, and it deserves to be named as such every time it happens. On the religious tradition, I'm not saying the religious tradition within Black life is uniformly colonized or uniformly complicit. Slave religion, the Cone books, Reading While Black, all of these document the liberatory tradition within Black Christianity. And that tradition is real and has done enormous work in the world. What I'm saying is that the same institution has also been used as a tool of accommodation and control. And holding both truths simultaneously is more honest than choosing one and pretending the other does not exist. On Haiti, I'm not saying Haiti is a simple model to replicate. The history after 1804, the debt imposed by France, the political instability, the decades of underdevelopment that followed the world's systematic punishment of successful Black liberation is itself a lesson. The example is inspiring. The aftermath is a warning. Both are a part of what the tradition has to learn from. On the possibility of liberation, I'm not saying liberation is easy, close, or guaranteed. I am saying that accurate orientation is worth more than false optimism, and that the tradition is longer, deeper, and more internally complex than the loyalty test allows you to see. The question of freedom, organized around genuine political interests rather than cultural performance, is still open, still worth asking, still worth organizing around, urgently. The freedom tradition is longer, more complex, more internally contested, and more practically useful than the loyalty test allows you to see. The loyalty test flattens the tradition into a single lane, and then grades everyone who ever drove it against the standards of one particular moment, in one particular political context. It turns liberation into a credential rather than a practice. It turns the question, are we moving toward freedom, into are you sufficiently committed to the correct definition of freedom? Those are not the same question. They never have been. Whiteness is not biology. It is a political project with a documented history of construction, maintained through deliberate policy choices across centuries. What was constructed can be examined, named, and dismantled, not by wishing it away, but by understanding precisely how it was built and what it was built to do. Colonization has consistent mechanisms: economic extraction, cultural destruction, the colonization of the mind, the internalization of the oppressor's standards until the oppressor barely needs to show up anymore. Understanding those mechanisms does not produce despair. It produces precision. Precision is the beginning of strategy. You cannot fight a system you have mistaken for nature. Liberation organized around freedom means grounding analysis in material conditions and shared political interests, not in cultural performance. It means holding the whole tradition, including the parts that disagree with each other, especially those parts. It means conscientization, the ongoing, collective, necessarily imperfect practice of seeing the situation clearly enough to act in it, and then doing the work of acting in it, together. So, back to where we started. What are the colored people doing for themselves? Here's what I want to say now that I couldn't say in the cold open. The question is good. The question is necessary. Every generation has to ask it, has to look at the conditions of its own time and ask, what are we doing? What are we building? What are we naming? What are we refusing? What now? What's next? The answer is the tradition. The living, arguing, updating, imperfect, powerful tradition. Douglas learning to read by firelight in a city that had made literacy a crime for him. Wells going into the counties with a notebook and coming back with evidence that the whole machinery of lynching was economic and not moral, and then building the international pressure when the domestic doors were blocked. James analyzing Haiti from a library in London and Trinidad and producing a book that the world has been trying to contain for nearly a century. Shakur crossing a border and choosing to keep living rather than perform the martyrdom the state had scripted for her. King writing in a jail cell to people who told him to slow down. Producing a document still read in churches and classrooms and courtrooms today. Du Bois publishing fiction and sociology and autobiography and journalism and a magazine and a global analysis across 7 decades. Because the situation required all of it, and he had the capacity and the discipline to give all of it. What are the colored people doing for themselves? They're reading, organizing, analyzing the conditions with precision and refusing to accept the version of reality the system needs them to accept. They are arguing with each other about strategy, which is not disloyalty. It is the sign of a living tradition. A tradition that is still alive is a tradition that can still act, and a tradition that can still act is still dangerous to the forces that need it contained, in the same direction. Freedom is not a solo project. That is what the Ubuntu tradition was telling us at the beginning of this episode. I am because we are. James wrote so that the revolution could be understood by people who were not there. Ella Baker built organizations designed to outlast the leaders so that the work could continue when individuals fell. Harriet Tubman went back after she had crossed, went back 19 times. She went back because freedom is not a private achievement, it is a collective condition, and you are not fully free while the people behind you are still in the middle of it. Every act of personal liberation in this tradition carries an obligation to the people still in the middle of it, to the ones who made it possible to be where you are, to the ones watching to see what freedom looks like so they can learn its shape and follow it. The personal insight opens onto communal responsibility. It always has. It cannot. So when you ask yourself, am I loyal enough? Am I black enough? Am I enough? Ask a second question right alongside it. Free enough for what? Free enough to build what? Free enough to go back for who? So here are 3 questions that I want to leave with you. First, where in your life have you been running the loyalty test? On yourself or on someone else, without examining whose standards were actually built into the test? Second, of the figures from the freedom tradition named in this episode, which one's method most closely matches the conditions you are actually navigating right now? Not the conditions you wish you were navigating, but the ones you are genuinely in. And third, what would it look like in one specific relationship or community space in your life to organize around shared political interests rather than shared cultural performance? That was a lot. I know it was a lot. That was a longer episode. A lot of tradition to move through, and I did not want to shortchange any of it. If you stayed for the full run, thank you. Genuinely, that is not a small thing. I'll place the full book list in the show notes, every text cited in this episode in order. If I'm sending you to 3 right now, C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins, I.D.B. Wells's Crusade for Justice, and Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, start there. Let those 3 books talk to each other inside you. See what they unlock. If this episode helped something make sense, if something clicked or landed differently than it has before, or gave you language for something you've been carrying without a name, share it. Leave a review. Send it to the person who would argue with it. This work needs to reach the people who need it. Help it get there. In the next episode, we're talking about the wound economy and what capitalism does with all of it. You don't want to miss it. Until the next time we engage in discovery, introspection, and growth, see you. Get nosy, be nosy, stay nosy, and keep moving forward. I'm MJ, and this is Brain Boogerz.